Okay, this is the presentation for Module 5. We are in week 6. So this week we're going to talk about corrective feedback. Corrective feedback is the feedback that learners receive on their linguistic errors, so their language errors, and their errors could either be in oral form or written form, okay? So here's some frequently asked questions that everybody wants to know. Should learners' errors be corrected? When should their errors be corrected? Which errors should be corrected? And then how should their errors be corrected? There are two types of corrective feedback. The first one is oral corrective feedback, and then the second one is written corrective feedback. Okay, so we're going to start off with talking about oral corrective feedback. So the teacher can offer two things. The teacher can offer a online feedback or offline feedback. Online feedback is immediately, right after the error occurs. Offline feedback is after the speaker finishes their thought, finishes speaking, okay? And you can support the learner in two ways. Input providing is simply the speaker is given the correct form, okay? Output prompting is when the teacher supports the student to try to come up with the correct language, okay? And the learner can be corrected explicitly or implicitly. Okay, so an implicit correction, the teacher is going to request some type of clarification. The teacher will let the learner know that their message wasn't understood. Okay, the explicit correction, the teacher directly corrects what the learner said, and usually the teacher provides some type of explanation of the error. Okay, so I'm going to use the example. The student is given a picture card, and they hold up a picture of several tomatoes on the card, and the student says, "I see a tomatoes." Okay, so an implicit correction would be the teacher saying, "Do you see one tomato or more than one tomato?" Okay, so the teacher is basically facilitating self-correction. An explicit correction would be the teacher saying, "You have tomatoes." If there were only one, we would say a tomato, but you see more than one. You see tomatoes. Let's say it together. Okay, so that's an example of those two types of corrections. Some more ways to correct speakers orally would be repetition. So this is output prompting because the teacher is wanting the student to self-correct, but the teacher basically is going to repeat back what the learner or speaker said, and they're going to use their voice, so their tone, accent, to help the learner see the error. Okay, and a recast, which is the most common type of correction feedback, is input providing. So you're giving them information, and the teacher is going to rephrase what the speaker said without the error. Okay, and a lot of times recasts are ineffective. As I said previously, it's the most common type of feedback, but it's ineffective because most learners don't even realize that you're correcting them, and they just agree, but they're not cognitively processing that you corrected them. Okay, so we're going to switch to written corrective feedback. And written corrective feedback is different. This is when a student writes something and then they turn it in, okay? So the teacher can only give them feedback offline because feedback is provided when the written text or assignment has been turned in, okay? And the learner can be supported in two ways. Input providing would be the student being provided a correct form. So we've all turned in papers and it has red marks all over it. There was an error, the teacher fixed the error, and you can see how they fixed it. Okay? Output providing would be the teacher making it known that there was an error, but not fixing it. So the teacher may circle the errors or highlight the errors in hope of pulling out some type of self-correction from the student. Okay? And then there's going to be explicit correction. The teacher is going to correct the learner, but because it's a written assignment, the teacher may not go into explaining why they made the error. Okay? Okay, so you may be asking, how do the theories tie into the things that we're going to be learning in the upcoming weeks? Because we've kind of got all of our background knowledge, our theories and our methods, our approaches out of the way. We're going to be applying those things to different practical, applicable applications when working with ELLs. Okay, so Krashen believed that there was no need for error correction, that learners are monitoring using what they learned, and they're monitoring their production, and they will correct on their own. Okay, Skinner believed that there absolutely should be error corrections. Okay, and that's a part of the positive and negative reinforcement. If you do something right, you're positively enforced. If you do something wrong, you're negatively reinforced. Most teachers come to the agreement that errors do need to be corrected, but there's no best way. There's no 1, 2, 3 step process to do this. Okay? Errors need to be corrected, but not all errors need to be corrected, not all the time, and not for all students. It takes a lot of discernment to decide which errors to correct, and there's a lot of things to consider. Okay, so there's no simple process, and we have to consider the learner's English proficiency level, because when they are in those lower levels, we don't want to be correcting them all the time. That is going to make them shut down and stop experimenting, negotiating with the language. So some common errors that learners make, the first one being irregular verbs. So they really struggle with generalizing how they use verbs, and they want to put ed at the end of every verb, okay? Such as walk and walked. So instead of saying ran, they would say runned. Instead of saying swam, they would say swimmed. Or instead of saying cut, they would say cutted. Okay, so they just overgeneralize their rules, start to put ed at the end of everything, and it's easy to hear. Once you really learn how to listen to the words that the students are saying, you'll notice it, especially with early learners, because they've just learned that grammar rule, and then they start to apply it to every verb that they use in the past tense. Okay. Other errors are prepositions. English language learners really struggle to use prepositions correctly. And then the prepositions combined with the verb makes a phrasal verb. And those are really hard for them to understand. And they have many different meanings. So that's a common error that they will make as well. Okay? Other common errors would be the use of homographs and homophones, and this would be used a lot during writing. Okay, and then it could also be an error in comprehension. So you could be talking about a baseball bat, but they may be thinking you're talking about the bat that flies. Or you could be talking about the number 8 and they're processing somebody ate something. Okay. So we're going to look at this example. I visit my aunt yesterday. And we're going to go through different ways to correct this. So an explicit correction, that would be when you want the learner to know that they made an error, would be not quite. It's not I visit my aunt, it's I visited my aunt. Okay? It happened in the past, so we put an ED on the end of the word visit. Typically, this doesn't work with younger learners because this is a developmental error. They haven't learned this rule yet. And older learners typically like this because they've learned the rule and they want to learn the exceptions to the rule. Okay? And implicit correction would be for the teacher to indicate to the student that they didn't quite understand. Okay, so you want to give them some type of indication so that they can start working on self-correcting it. So you might say, pardon me, or I didn't understand. And then that cues the learner to start trying to self-correct, start trying to process where their error was and how they can fix it. Repetition would be to repeat back, and you would use a tone to cue the learner to start to self-correct. So you would say, I visit my aunt. And so when you say visit in that way, the learner starts to think, oh, something was wrong with the way I said that. How can I fix it? To recast, you would rephrase what they said without the error. So if they say, I visit my aunt yesterday, to explicitly recast, you would say, oh, you visited your aunt last week, or oh, you visited your aunt yesterday. To implicitly recast, you would say, I visited my aunt yesterday too. So you can see why a lot of learners would know that they've been corrected and why recast is not that effective. Okay, so we learned about an explicit correction giving, I mentioned it earlier, metalinguistic feedback. And basically, you want the learner to start thinking about their thinking and to start to cue that process of self-correction, but you want them to know why. Okay? So you would say, there's a mistake in the verb tense. That might be something you would say with older students. Or, is it visit yesterday? You might say something like, I don't think we visit yesterday. Okay? So again, this cues their self-correction, their thinking, but then you're going to explain why they made an error and where they made an error. Okay? And then for output prompting, that is leading them. You're facilitating their self-correction. Okay, so you might say something like, so yesterday you visit, again, that cues self-correction. Hey, how do we say visit if it already happened? Or you might say, is it yesterday we visit or yesterday we visited? And that's just going to start the ball rolling for them. And they're going to be thinking about, I made an error. I must have made an error when I said visit. How can I fix it? Okay, so a few feedback strategies that you could use in the classroom are listed here. One is to use a variety of feedback. So you don't want to correct the student, give them the same feedback every time the same way. Sometimes students need explicit feedback. You're making this error. Here's why. You're going to give them some metalinguistic feedback so that hopefully they will correct it. Because the goal is correction, for them to correct the language, the form. Okay? And you want to be consistent. The third one is my favorite one. Do not interfere while they are speaking. When English language learners are speaking, they're doing a lot of brain work to get out what they're trying to say. And so don't interrupt them. If you need to, jot notes on post-it notes, but while they're speaking, don't interrupt while they're speaking. Okay? And you should always consider the language proficiency level of the learner, and you're going to use that information to decide what type of feedback you're going to give them. If you have a very early learner, and let's say they're a newcomer, they've only been in the country 6 months, you're not going to explain to them why they need to change the word visit to visited and to add ed at the end because it happened in the past. They don't have the capacity to do that yet. Okay? Actually, they probably wouldn't have even spoken that sentence, but you never know. Also, you are going to want to allow time for students to self-correct. When students are monitoring their speaking, that's when they are growing the most. Not when we're telling them what to say, but when they realize that they've made an error and then they actually do the mental work to figure out how to fix it. Okay? And then you're going to use your voice. You're going to use your intonation to help them recognize their errors. You're not going to give them the answer. You're going to facilitate. You're going to lead them to fixing the form, the language. And then the last one, you are not going to use a lengthy explanation. As we learned in our last module in the communicative language approach, being able to communicate effectively is the goal, not knowing every grammar rule. Can people understand what you're trying to say? That's the goal. Okay, so you don't want to give lengthy explanations to explain the error. That will probably go straight over their head. Okay, so there's 3 types of corrections that we want to see: self-correction, peer correction, and teacher correction. The goal is self-correction. The goal is for students to be monitoring their own language, their own writing, and to self-correct. Okay. So we spent a lot of time talking about oral errors and oral corrective feedback, but what about writing feedback? Think about the students that, of course, may be further along in the language proficiency skills, and they are now writing. Okay, so you want to provide them feedback because you want them to be able to write effectively. So one way is to provide written feedback to them. So when they turn in written work to you, you provide them some type of feedback in a written form. You may use a teacher-student response journal. So they write to you, you write to them. They write to you, you write to them. And if you choose to do that system and you use symbols to correct their work, provide a key so they always know, like what a little caret means, or if you circle it 2 times, what that means. And then the last one is my favorite because it's what I get to do a lot with my early learners, is conferencing. You actually sit down with the learner. You may have a goal for your meeting, and conferences can be quick. They can be 2 to 3 minutes. Conferences can be longer. They can be 10 minutes, and you actually discuss the writing, their ideas, and it is a good time to choose even one skill to quickly teach, practice, and then they will go on and practice it independently. Okay, so I know I said I use this with younger learners, but you would also want to consider the student's proficiency level. If they are at a beginning proficiency level, even if they're older, they would benefit from conferencing. I personally think all students benefit from conferencing because it's different reading a teacher's response and getting to actually sit down with the teacher and discuss the writing between the 2 of you. Okay, so bottom line here, learners' errors should be corrected. If they're not, the learner will become fossilized. Okay, so they will have practiced those errors so much that it will become a permanent part of their speaking abilities. When should learners' errors be corrected? It should be after they finish their thought, after they finish speaking. Okay? And also, if they're making the same error over and over and over again, I think that might be a case where you need to interrupt, but I think you need to make sure that you are doing it with discretion. Think about you as a speaker. Would you like to be constantly interrupted? I don't think I wouldn't. And so we need to make sure we're cognizant of how our learners feel also. And then the last one, which errors should be corrected? For beginners, errors that affect the meaning of what they're trying to say should be corrected. For advanced learners, their form and their grammar should be the focus of the corrections. Okay, that's all I have for you this week. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, and have a great weekend.